Starting the stream.
All righty.
Hello. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we invite you.
There we go. I see the stream live. Success. Technology functions as it's supposed to. Once in a while, anyhow.
It's funny, I was getting the echo because the sound was on the video.
Oh.
All right. And we don't know if we'll get anybody right up front, but we're doing it and they can watch it later.
Yep.
Do you
I do
show
like to
anybody
have
in there right now?
Do I? No, not right now, but who knows? No, it says concurrent viewers 3. So yeah, there you go.
Cool. That's probably you and me and
maybe one other person.
maybe one.
Well, the thing is, like, my wife is working fairly long hours right now, but during Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And so that puts me in dad mode during the weekdays therein. And, my daughter is attending virtual kindergarten. So it's not like I can just leave her to her own devices, go play in your room, go watch a show, go play in the backyard. Those are all wonderful things when I have those moments of opportunity. But when it's class time, I'm effectively a teacher's assistant. And so any bonus time that I might have away from that, I was scrambling to package up more books and print shipping labels and, sign, like I usually sign like 30 or 40 books at a time and let the ink dry and then move them over. And I got this whole assembly process going.
Right.
And I'm still trying to ship out all those darn books. So I think there was 110 that went out today. And so that was just barely squeaked it in before we did the critique show. I came in like 5 minutes before we were supposed to go live, and mission accomplished. But yeah, I wasn't able to properly promote the fact that we were doing this live today.
That's all right. It'll be in the podcast feed too. People can subscribe, Photo Geek Weekly, wherever they get their podcasts.
Stephen O'Neill says, hi, guys. Hi, Stephen. Great to have you here.
Hey, Stephen.
And again, I need to be doing more of this live stuff. Steve, you've basically been pushing all the buttons when we do the live episodes, and that's wonderful. Thank you for that. But I do need to be self-sufficient at some point. So as soon as all the books are done, I need to spend a couple of days. Well, first, I need to spend a couple of days getting my corporate taxes done because my corporate year end is end of June. So I gotta do that. But once that's done, it's always like there's gonna be one more thing that's gonna be mucking things up. But
this is what I'm doing.
Right, and I have the ATEM Mini Pro ISO here, and I've got a Stream Deck here, and I got them. I just got to get those things configured properly to do the switches and the magic that you do so well. That's almost second nature to you.
The magic that you do. I have fun with it. It's a lot of fun, and it just, for me, especially like the critique show that we just did, it just adds that little extra flavor to do it live. I kind of like that.
I do. I don't think that a critique show would work well if it wasn't live. The audience feedback is so important, and it's not to say that you can't review it afterwards,
right?
But it's just that it has that, as the French would say, the je ne sais quoi of being live and being.
My mute switch is not working well today. I noticed you just reset Zencaster. Was that intentional?
I did, yes,
okay,
because
good.
It was from the previous test recording, and now we are all health checked and passed, ready to record this episode. Everything is primed and ready.
Good to go, my friend. You tell me when you're ready, and I will hit go. Do we have more than 3 now? Steven's here,
I don't know.
So we got 4.
I'll have to check that out. Your pick of the week. Oh, was the I won't say what it is. I'll just cue.
Yeah, don't say it. But I will say it's pretty awesome upgrade.
I am just making sure that I have a copy of that open in a browser tab. And Terry is there. Thank you for being here, Terry.
Hey, Terry.
We've got it still says it says 5 concurrent viewers, so 5 people are along for the ride at the very least at this point in the game. All right.
I mean, we didn't promote this at all until like 2 seconds ago, so
yeah. Well, and if anybody was watching the critique show, which we kind of went overtime on that, and so that was like I don't know, an hour and 45 minutes or so.
Yeah.
There's only so
normally
much.
We're an hour and 15, maybe.
There's only so much of Don and Steve that I think people can properly digest without heartburn in a daily basis. So
Agreed. Agreed. And I'm going to turn my air on, so you may have I'm going to turn my noise reduction on too, because I am dying in here right now. I turned it
yeah, I
off
don't
for the
think
other
we
one.
heard any issue with your air conditioner
No,
in
but I'm
the
going to turn it
last
back on
episode.
right
So
now. So let me turn my noise reduction back on here. Hold on, and that way we'll have all that set. It just kicked in right now. Dun, dun, dun. Got that. Where are you? Right there. Right there. Noise assist.
this is entertainment value. Steve fiddling with buttons on a remote control like an old man.
Well, and the thing is, let me just check what level I've got it at. It should be at 5. Just to be safe. I'm at 6. Does it sound normal to you?
It sounds normal.
Yeah, it should.
I mean, for those 5 words you said.
I'm gonna
Hey,
put it.
Gary's here. Gary, yeah, who left the lights on?
There we go. I got noise
We're
reduction on my mic now, just so that you don't hear the air conditioner so bad.
back again. I'm sure you'll sound great.
Who
and
left
we
the
got
lights on? I love it. All right.
All right, Steve, are
good to
you
go?
ready? You ready?
I'm ready. I will. I'll hit your open, and you can see everything that's happening. You can take it away.
Here we go. Welcome to Photo Geek Weekly, episode 150, recorded on June 11th of 2021, the Photo Geekery Show, where I'm your host, Don Komarechka, and I geek out about photo things, usually with a guest host, and it's industry news, and this week we actually have some really sciencey stuff. And what better a guest to have on a super sciencey show than my very good friend, Steve Brazel. Steve, how are you doing today?
I'm doing quite well. Thank you, as always, for having me, because it's a highlight of my week when I'm on this show.
Well, and of course, I already knew you were doing well because we just finished wrapping up the Behind the Shot critique show, which we do once a month on your YouTube channel, and you can find that at the BehindTheShot.tv website as well. That's going well for you. I think you've had some pretty good interviews lately with some very charismatic photographers and their images. I've enjoyed those conversations.
Thank you very much. The one that I've got out right now was really wild to do. It's with Estras Suarez, a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner. A shot of Islamic fighters in Gaza City. Crazy photojournalism shot. And I've got some great people. One of the official photographers of the band The Who, I'll be recording with coming up soon. I've got a couple Canon Explorers of Light coming up. Yeah, it's fun. I Behind the Shot is one of those, just kind of like you with this show. I just love doing it.
Yeah, and I don't get paid to do this podcast, although every once in a while somebody puts some money into a tip jar, and that's fine. That helps pay the bills of keeping all the bandwidth affordable. But I have been, and Steve, I wanted to actually ask your opinion on this because Apple's been making lots of announcements. Apple, they've got we had the whole Apple WWDC recently, and not a whole lot of things really pertain to photographers. This isn't a story in the rundown per se, but prior to that, Apple had also announced that they were opening up a subscription model to their podcasting, and I've been looking at that with the possibilities of. And I want to say this right off the top for anybody that listens to this podcast. Would you be willing to pay like $1 a month, $2 a month, maybe?
And you can do yearly discounts. So you could do $1 a month or $10 a year, I believe.
And that's not to say that you would have to pay that, because if you didn't want to pay anything, you'd still get it. It's just, okay, maybe I would put the Inside the Lens podcast, which is very seldomly updated with new stuff, but maybe that would be the incentive for me to record more of those episodes and have that as an added bonus to subscribers. But the Photo Geek Weekly podcast is always going to be completely free for everybody. I think that makes sense. And if you enjoy this content, that would allow me to spend more time on it. And, it's been a labor of love for a very long time. This is episode 150. It's a milestone number for me. And, well, I'm glad it's still going. I'm glad people are still listening to this thing and that the numbers are still growing. So
that's an interesting question, though, because same here. My podcast is a labor of love. It's not cheap because it's video. And I have an actual video feed. So my podcast hosting, I've got to store the video. I've got the editing time. I've got booking the guests, blah, 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 blah. But I love doing it. The question is, would people pay for what they can already get free? Okay, you throw some extra stuff in. And what I think would happen is you'd end up with those people who are really enjoy the content you create, just doing it because they want to support you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that I've had some success with that. People wanting to support me in various crowdfunding campaigns that I've done in the last little while. My most recent one being my book, which you now have a copy of, and I saw you do a really wonderful unboxing video.
Yeah.
Between now and the last time that we talked. So I'm going to put a link to the unboxing video in the show notes at photogeekweekly.com when this episode goes live there. But and you're holding up anaglyph
I feel like
glasses.
I'm in the 1950s when I do this.
Well, that's obviously when they were sort of invented, or I think it predates that. But that's when you might have gone to a black and white movie in the cinema that was projected in anaglyph, and you would wear the glasses and you would see it in 3 dimensions. And sadly, actually, a lot of those movies from that vintage, they don't exist anymore. They weren't properly archived, and they are just lost in time. Some still exist, and my wife and I were joking the other day that we should probably just set one up on the computer and put those glasses on, make some old-timey popcorn, and just kind of laugh at how bad that was and how gimmicky it was at the time. But I digress. We do have some interesting stories to get into.
Oh yes, we do.
This week. And some of them kind of get just as geeky as throwing on those red blue anaglyph glasses and seeing things in 3 dimensions. But the first story anyhow goes all the way back to not exactly the beginnings of photography, but very close to it. An article from DP Review. Physicists now understand the multispectral qualities of the world's first color photographs. And so I'll read a little bit of this article. And Steve, I want your opinion on. You told me earlier that you explained this or attempted to explain this to your wife yesterday. And I want to know how you did it, because I don't think I was successful.
So basically, I leaned heavy on the fact that it's multiple spectrums, that it's 26 to 64 spectral samples, as opposed to it's multispectral light measurements. And
so
I kind of leaned on that.
Let's discuss what we're talking about here. Jonas Ferdinand Gabriel Lippmann, known as Gabriel Lippmann, accomplished a lot during his 75 years. Born in Luxembourg in 1845, Lippmann, a physicist, was a pioneer of color photography. His method of producing color photographs, which relied upon interference phenomenon, earned Lippmann the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1908. So, keep in mind, 1908 ridiculously predates color film in any form. So what we're looking at here is a way for you to use interference patterns recorded in silver halide. So it is a black and white image that has an encoded interference pattern that can reveal color imagery within. So like if you were to view this with just a regular, let's say improper illumination, like if you just hold it up to a light or what have you, it's going to look like a black and white negative for the most part. And they don't show an inverted version of it to see if it would be properly black and white or what have you. But with what they call proper illumination, you are able to create a color image well, if you won the Nobel Prize in 1908, we'll assume that the technique was successfully demonstrated prior to that time. And so that is well over 100 years ago. And you can see some really interesting, and there's a whole article on DP Review that describes how the technical process works. And So how did you describe it to your wife then? Because
Okay.
I think I failed when I was trying to
Well,
relate it to snowflakes, which was just
and
conflating the
the
issue.
way that I described it is technically inaccurate, but got the sense across is probably a good way to word it.
Right.
So his work relied on interference phenomenon. And I'm going to quote from the article here. His technique relies on the same interference principles that recently enabled gravitational waves to be detected, and which is the foundation for holography. And so he captured 26 to 64 spectral samples for his photos. And the key there is that it is multispectral light measurements. In fact, it's the earliest multispectral light measurements that the researchers and authors of a paper that's referenced in this had seen. That's what caused them to want to go try and recreate it. And so here's the example I used, which, while technically inaccurate, kind of will get the point across. When you think multispectral light, think about visible light, what we see. Then think about ultraviolet light. Then think about whatever other types of light you might have, infrared, etc.
But let's take a look at the visible spectrum, because it goes from 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a 300 nanometer window of light that we see, and that is collected as regular visible light. And of course, ultraviolet is shorter, infrared is longer, and so on. But that doesn't mean that you've got to collect it all at once. You can break it up into bands and do things with that specifically. Now, I'm not sure exactly how he was breaking light up into different...
And that's the question is, we don't know. They don't really say in here what spectrums he was capturing. But the idea of multispectral is what I leaned on in that. Imagine if you could capture everything from UV to infrared, visible, all in one shot, and then later reverse engineer what those spectrums were seeing that you may not see in the end result to extract the original image. And that's kind of what they're doing here. Again, I'm way oversimplifying and going arguably down the way wrong road, but it gets you the idea of there are multiple spectrums that he's capturing.
Yeah, I think that the description here in terms of what we're looking at is going to be, I think, properly the visible spectrum. But you're using an interference pattern to encode things, and I might be wrong in how I interpret
well, not just encode, to actually distort. You're distorting the colors.
Yep.
That are in the spectrum.
And so I related this to some of my experience with snowflakes, because I'm the weird mad scientist guy that can relate snowflakes to anything. But I have seen colors in ice.
Hold on. We just have to check and make sure that's true. I'll say a word. You say a word back. Hamburger.
Snowflake.
It's been proven.
So the idea is that you can have thin film interference in, well, just about anything. A soap bubble, an oil spot. I've seen it in snowflakes, where you have light interfering with itself that then creates color. And in a snowflake, you've got a layer of ice and then a layer of air. It's a bubble trapped inside the ice, and then you have a layer of ice underneath that. And light would hit the first layer of the ice and bounce off. Some of it would. Some of it wouldn't bounce off. It would go in and reflect off the inner boundary between ice and air. And so there'd be a bit of a gap there, but a very, very thin gap. And so the light that would enter into the ice would be slowed down for a very brief period of time. But because it's so thin, when it reflects off of that inner layer and goes back up, then it is now out of sync with the light that bounced right off the surface, but out of sync in such a way that a particular color is being generated. And so you can't get all colors by doing this. If you ever look at a birefringent scale, for using cross polarization, it looks very similar to the interference pattern scales. Not every color is represented. It's very hard to create reds, for example. They're just not very common along this process. So using interference patterns, and I'm not, it's a little bit hazy on the details as to exactly what the quote unquote proper illumination is going to be. And that might change based on process evolution over time. But you can see in the chart that we were just looking at on the screen there, that the interference representation of color, it's got a bunch of really jaggy lines because those are all of those little interference points that are trying to approximate the colors that we would normally be seeing with our own eyes. But that is what the closest thing that you can get with an interference pattern would be able to generate. So it's an approximation of it's a proper reconstruction as best as you could with this technique. But I'll be honest, I'd never heard of this technique before. And I mean, it's always been on my bucket list of just photographic stuff to explore is holography. And I've got some books on it that are just collecting dust, unfortunately. And if this is akin to holography, I might be able to try and tackle some of these at the same time. Because when you see these images in the right light at the right angle, and they just automatically have color in them, it seems magical. It is science masquerading as magic. I'll give it that. But it's really neat. Check out this technique, and I'm gonna have to dive deeper into it. I just took a cursory look at the article in DP Review, read some of the comments. And the final paragraph says, it's interesting enough to investigate Lippmann's early 20th century photographic technique using modern tools and science. However, the team believes that revisiting Lippmann's technique can inspire new technological developments as well. Further, the team has already constructed a prototype of a digital Lippmann camera. The team hopes that multispectral image synthesis and a multispectral camera could have intriguing benefits in the 21st century. And I agree. I'm not even sure what those benefits could possibly be. But keep in mind that, the way we are recording color in most cameras, aside from, Sigma's Foveon technology, is we are collecting independent samples of specific frequencies of light. And we're combining them together through a Bayer pattern or an X-trans pattern, but you have this color filter array that is then we have maths to figure out exactly what the colors are going to be at the end of that. But what if you didn't need that? Like, what if everything could be simply encoded in black and white, but the color information is still there? There could be advantages in terms of sensitivity. Again, sometimes certain colors might not be as readily reproducible. So maybe this would fall into the scientific realm, at least in the short term. But
no, I was just going to argue something, and that is going back to this chart. So they used a color checker to try and reverse engineer his original spectrum of light because the reflected spectrum was different than what was exposed. And they tried to reverse engineer that. And if you look at this chart, a couple of things are interesting to me. So first of all, the top one is the original that they took. The second line with the jaggy lines is them recreating a Lippmann plate. The third one is the reconstruction. Well, you can, because you know here how the reconstruction is different from the original, right? In this controlled environment, if that is consistent, not just with a color checker passport, but with other shots, if the waveforms of light, the spectrum of light that you're getting is predictable between the original and the reconstruction, then you could use AI to fix the mistakes in the reconstruction because it might be predictable.
Possibly. I mean,
so
in
those
the same
colors
way
you
that
say
you
may
can
not be able to be reproduced, they actually may be able to be reproduced if it, again, assuming that this reconstruction has a consistent model.
True, but maybe not so true, because it would be like trying to reconstruct a proper image from color blindness, right? Like if you're just missing certain information, you can interpret it and you can guess as to what it should be, but there are going to be guesses where certain things are going to be equal, like, putting a green filter on top of a black and white camera and only capturing a certain part of the spectrum and negating the reds. Well, reds might appear the same as blacks, and you because it would be filtered out of the lens, and so they would appear in the end data as the same thing, just as a dark tone, and you might not be able to recover that in every sense. But if it's a stop sign that looks black, then the artificial intelligence algorithms can obviously associate a stop sign with something that should be red,
Right.
and there might be some ways to compensate that.
But once you bring AI into it, there's a lot more to it than just look at these graphs.
Well,
right?
and Gary says in in the chat, he says that it sounds a lot like how they shoot galaxies and nebulas. Yeah, what NASA would do though is they would take like X-ray imagery and ultraviolet and infrared and deep thermal, and of course the visible spectrum in various different wavelengths. Hydrogen alpha is an important output that stars have, that is just around the, I think, 700 nanometer cutoff point in the visible spectrum, and they might do a separate image of that and then combine them together with whatever sorcery that the wonderful image engineers at NASA do to make it look like something that we would see with our own eyes, even though it pushes beyond that. I think that's a little bit different, Gary, in terms of how they're imaging and combining things together. But the fact is that you could potentially just collect the light in some encoded way and decode it to make a colorful image from just a monochromatic source, in a sense. I just find it fascinating.
It's fascinating. And I don't think you mentioned this. You mentioned that part of the distortion here is coming from shooting through a glass plate that has silver halide, but there's also a mirror involved, liquid mercury mirror that was involved in this.
And so that kind of goes on the...
Think about the time he did this.
Yeah, early 1900s, possibly even late 1800s, depending on when he started getting these ideas.
People were burned at the stake for things like this. This is craziness in those times, and I love every bit of it.
I love every bit of it as well. So I want people to take a look at this technology, and I would love to dive into the actual paper. I tried to look it up. It was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, but I could only really get sort of the abstract under my belt before I started seeing some crazy equations that didn't make any sense to me. And maybe to the actual physicists out there, this makes a little bit more sense. And if you're listening, actual physicists, and you can distill it down into layman's terms that we could better describe, I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, I would too. That would be awesome.
But let's talk about more science, not retroactively discovered, but something quote unquote revolutionary in the article from Petapixel. Revolutionary, quote, space plate could eliminate traditional camera lenses. And that's a bit of a grandiose statement. It would have to be paired with a meta lens in order to completely remove the lens. But there is a research paper published by researchers at the University of Ottawa that they've developed a concept that would reduce the size of a lens by a huge margin and effectively eliminate the size of modern optics if combined with a meta lens. And I think we've talked about meta lenses in the past on this podcast. This is not a meta lens. This is not like a thin plate that can function as a lens in itself. No, this is a mysterious rectangular prism object that I couldn't really figure out what it was made of or why it exactly behaves in this particular way. But what it does, this uniaxial space plate, if you could imagine that it would take light a long distance to converge, right? Just because you've got a telephoto lens and you've got to kind of take the largest element and through other elements and just kind of shrink that beam down. When you're doing that, it has to happen over a space, right? That's why you've got reflex telescopes that have a mirror at the base of it to send the light back to the front of the telescope and then come back down again in order to just let the light move along the longest distance that is required in order for you to get the resulting image. But what if you could put something in the path of the light that makes it attenuate faster? And so that your gap of, I'm just going to make up a number, say like it has to be, like 12 inches or so from one lens to the next lens, but you put something in that space and now that gap can close to 6 inches, right? You can cut it in half.
Let's be clear. You're saying one lens to another lens. Another way to word it would be one element to one element. Yes. Would probably make more sense to people.
That's right. And so there is this mystery object that in at the University of Ottawa that, this is quite valuable, because if you're trying to build compact telephoto optics or even smartphone optics that, you can't, you physically cannot build it with a particular space. But if you could put in a tiny sheet of this thing that eliminates a space, or uh, I don't know what forbidden magic would be actually making a lens element out of this strange material. I have no idea what that would actually entail, but you have the distinct possibility of shrinking down your optical system designs. Now, that's great for us here down on Earth, but what about space telescopes? There are
Yes,
so
this is
many this could be revolutionary if it doesn't do anything strange with the light, like, it completely changes the wavelengths, or
it doesn't sound like it
uh,
does. It does
it
not
doesn't
say
sound
it,
like it
it
does.
so what's interesting here is this to me is invention done right. So many people go out to try and solve the whole problem. And here they went, okay, we've already got meta lenses. Let's try and build on that. So the meta lenses let you shrink the optics themselves. Okay, great. The problem is that most light paths require space, like you were describing, between the elements. And again, a good example is a telescope. When you put, like the telescope sitting behind me over here, when I put an eyepiece in it, there's a distance that's needed. A good way to word it actually is the flange distance in a camera between where you attach the lens and the sensor itself. There is an expected amount of distance for light to spread. Their idea was, what if we could just compress the light spread, and control the light spread in such a way these two parts together let you, instead of, for example, normal lenses and normal light path require a certain position of the light ray. Now they're working on, it doesn't have to be in a certain position, it just has to come at the right angle.
Yep.
And if you take meta lenses, which shrink the physical optics, and you take the space plate, and shrink the space required, imagine the Hubble telescope that was needed to be put in the back of a giant space shuttle and released into space, shrunk down to a size where maybe you could fit it on a satellite
Yeah,
that
a
could go
large
to
pizza
Saturn.
box,
You could
right?
get a Hubble telescope effect on a ship that's flying by Saturn. Imagine.
Imagine. And but it doesn't just apply to space. As I mentioned, our humble smartphones that are itching for every possible way to increase their resolution, increase their reach and their range. We've seen some really interesting sort of periscope type designs using mirrors, so that the bulk of the lens is along a larger horizontal section that is then mirrored up, so that you can get, I think Samsung and possibly Sony and a few others have been showing prototypes of these types of smartphone lenses. But what if you adapted this technology to that as well? There could be either that same lengthy periscoping mirror thing that would get you the equivalent of an 800 millimeter lens or something ridiculous, because you can then compress the space in between, or just a lot smaller in general and more convenient, and possibly, depending on the cost of how much this is to manufacture, less expensive as well.
Well, that last part's a big one. But what's interesting is, reading the article, they seem, based on a couple of the sentences, to indicate that the level they're at right now is a 5-time reduction in space. But they're currently working, when I say space, I don't mean outer space. I mean in the space used, right?
Right.
They're working on getting to 100-time, and increasing the distance that it can be transmitted. So now you're talking space plates plus meta lenses equals smaller optics with less space, applicable in so many ways.
A lot of these concepts become just an article to be quoted casually when new technology comes out, but this really does feel like it has practical applications, but not just practical applications that we'll see someday. Practical applications that are directly, that can be directly built into science and consumer products, for which billions of dollars are being spent to develop the next round of technology. And while that next round of technology is probably well underway, the round after that probably has a lot of question marks and unknowns associated with exactly how they're going to achieve the next level of performance.
Yeah.
I mean, the James Webb Telescope, how many decades was that being worked on? So some of these things are really long form, and it's going to take a while before we see it properly adopted in all of our, lofty ideas of to where this technology could end up. But if you could limit the space that light takes to just refocus itself, um, then without creating a lens effect on its own, I think that we've got a real winning material that I seriously hope that that the team led by Dr. Orad Resheff, a senior postdoctoral fellow in the Robert Boyd Group, and Dr. Jeff Lundin, Canada's research chair in quantum photonics, an associated professor in the Department of Physics at the University of Ottawa. I hope they patent this. I mean, I want those brilliant minds to benefit from inventions like this, and to hopefully, create a new environment for us to explore as photographers.
And some of the benefits are just so simple, right? The last story we're going to talk about, I won't share it now, but the last story we're going to talk about has to do with a lens that's huge and heavy, and just the benefit of this is just carrying it, weight, the ability to have possibly, making a leap forward on the technology in my mind here. If you can get those optics shrunk down, now you've saved weight. If you can get the space shrunk down, you've saved size. So now just a landscape photographer hiking to Mount Everest could take crazy glass with them, in theory. There's just so many cool things.
Well, I mean, you can get, I think Tokina
Did you see what
makes,
Terry wrote in the chat?
Spell check
glasses. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. There you go. But so the idea of like a Tokina, I think, has a 400 millimeter reflex lens, which is this tiny little lens that it'll give you weird donut bokeh because of it's using this sort of telescope technology and what have you. It's not ideal, and it's manual focus, and I think like the F13 or something, but that exists because you might want to take some really big glass out in the field on a hike. But if there's a better solution, I'm all for it. Now, also, striking the news, and it's going to be a good episode when I'm pulling articles from phys.org.
When you sent me this link, the first thought that hit me was, how did he even find this thing?
It came across my news feed because the algorithms of the internet know what to feed me. And so there is a light shrinking material that lets an ordinary microscope see in super resolution. So this is actually a problem that we see with smartphone sensors, and it's one of the reasons why I am sort of against the idea of having crazy high megapixel counts on incredibly small sensors, because at some point you are limited by the wavelength of light itself, right? Red light is 700 nanometers. If you make a photo site on a sensor smaller than that, well, you're battling against yourself, because red light's not going to fit inside. It's going to be highly distorted or not as represented as it should be. So this is another crazy new material that it looks like somehow, and I'm not sure of exactly what the physics are, but there's a picture here that you're showing that takes, and it's not doing what you're thinking. What's depicted is a square that looks like it is just dark and tinted.
It almost looks like carbon paper under a light or on a light table. It
sort of
looks like nothing.
But what I'm assuming is happening here, based on the article, is they're taking white light and they are shrinking its wavelength somehow. And again, there's the mystery science as to how they're exactly doing that is unknown to me, but it's much darker. So my guess is they are somehow, because you can't just shrink the wavelength of light, because the smaller wavelengths are higher energy. Where would that energy come from? But in doing this, it gets a lot darker. So by some voodoo, they are they're taking the volume of light at a higher or at a longer wavelength and converting that into less volume of light at a shorter wavelength, with probably some loss in the process. Now, this is important because if you are shooting an image with a shorter wavelength, you inherently have higher resolution. And so if you are attaching that to a sensor, that it's almost like you're shifting the entire visible spectrum from 400 to 700 nanometers down to like, I don't know, 300 to 600. That doesn't sound like a huge shift, but it could increase the resolution significantly on very small things with microscopy. Or if you can design a lens using quartz optics or other things that allow a high transmission of ultraviolet light, and you know exactly what that shift is down into a shorter wavelength, then you can create smaller pixels for smartphones. And the software in the camera itself will know exactly how to remap those wavelengths back to what the visible spectrum will be. So you've got a combination of revolutionary new technology, exotic optics, of course, that would require the transmission of shorter wavelength light, and software in computational photography that is able to correct for that back to the world that we see with our own eyes, all to the end of allowing for smartphones to have higher resolutions and microscopes to have higher resolutions with this little fancy magic wafer.
Well, and
Does that make
so the
sense?
little, yes, it does. And the little magic fancy wafer is what's so fascinating to me about this whole thing is you don't need any specific gear. It's just the wafer. Like if you add this wafer to any normal microscope, any light microscope, it turns it into a super resolution microscope.
This is not entirely true, though, Steve.
Well,
because
according to the article, though, it specifically says if you put a sample on the material and put it under a normal microscope, no fancy modifications needed.
well, it all depends on what the transmission properties of light are for the objective used in the
guessing
microscope.
on phys.org, though, they wouldn't say that.
They make microscope.
I won't say another website name, but if this was a photo website, I might think, okay, they tried to simplify it. But the fact that this is the article on phys.org, I'm gonna kind of go with them that you're going to get benefit on a normal scope. And we should, by the way, we should add, why does this matter? If you are trying to shoot, they talk about the fact that a normal light microscope has a resolution limit of about 200 nanometers, whereas this tech can go subcell to 40 nanometers. And the reason that matters is if you want to see subcell material in a living cell, you can't do that with a normal light microscope.
You would need to use a confocal microscope or something a little bit more exotic. But here's the thing. My point was about the optics involved. You can use a regular microscope that has a regular objective and not get the perfect results. But they make microscope objectives that are tailored to the transmission in shorter wavelengths. In ultraviolet, all the big manufacturers, Michitoyo, Nikon, etc., Olympus, they'll make UV objectives that just have greater transmission in the UV spectrum attached to a regular microscope, not a confocal or anything else that's strange. So I think that you would still need to pair it with an ultraviolet objective. And in doing so, because again, the wavelengths have become shorter, you want to make sure that they're passing through the lens, and you'd have to have a sensor that is also able to detect those shorter wavelengths of light. But again, you don't need a different microscope.
I'm going to lean on them, and that is what you're saying with the eyepiece may make a difference, may improve it. But I'm going to kind of guess based on reading this article. I read this thing 3 times, and I'm kind of guessing that you're going to see benefit with no added stuff.
You will, because if you have 700 nanometers that becomes 500 nanometers, then it's still completely viewable with a regular objective. However, you will lose the I guess the visibility of things that are already in the blues and the violets that then get shifted to shorter wavelengths. Those might just 40 disappear.
Nanometers in this, and they're referencing anyway. So, but here's the thing. If you use one of those special microscopes, like an electron microscope, you generally have a vacuum chamber. So you can't have live cells. So even if it's a minor modification, as you're saying, a different objective or something like that, still the ability to see live cells at a subcell level, this is scientific gold. Right.
This is going to revolutionize the way that we investigate and explore science on a very small scale. And it's all predicated on the idea that, what we are limited by the resolution of light and the wavelengths of visible light, the stuff that we can record and see. If we could somehow remap that to smaller numbers, that solves the problem. And
Yeah.
again, that somehow is unknown to me in this article. And I'm pretty sure that they would keep this as whatever secret sauce they have in order to make this happen, at least until it's patented and can be profited from. But wow, this was really cool because it's not just the sciencey stuff. This could have an impact on our smartphones and the resolutions in the cameras that we use. So 2 articles back to back, that space plate technology, pair that with a metal lens, pair that with this light shrinking material and a new sensor that can detect all the wavelengths that come on the other side of that. I thought that we were kind of nearing the end of how cameras could progress, especially on a small scale. These articles together show me that we have a lot still to go. And yeah, a normal microscope, no fancy modification needed. A different objective is no fancy modification. Most
Right.
regular
Again, they're
microscopes.
not saying no modification, no fancy. So that's a good catch. But again, to the people at UCSD that did this, really on it, this is one of those, like, sometimes Don picks these stories like this one that you kind of go, I don't even know how he can read this and understand it. And this is one of those stories that as I read this and then I read it again and then I read it again last night, I'm looking at it going, I'm really excited to see what comes from this. Right? I mean, this really
Yeah.
could revolutionize science on levels from medical to innovation.
The more we can observe, the more we can know. The more we know, the more
Exactly.
questions we can ask that we otherwise wouldn't have even thought to ask, and the more solutions to problems we will discover.
Or I
So,
will word it slightly differently than you. I mean, it's not a ton different, but I would almost say it's almost like macro photography, the universe at our feet. Sorry, I had to do it.
no, plug in my book, Steve. I'm glad you like the book. Have you had a chance to read through it at all?
Yes, I have. And the first thing I did was pull these things out and start doing the 3D stereoscopic images. I will say it is, I, during my I did an unboxing video for those that don't know. And during the unboxing video that I did, I alluded to this too. I know Dawn. I knew this book was going to be off the charts, crazy detailed fun. I am even surprised at how much detail is in this freaking book. It is, I'm telling people the way I'm describing it is it's the encyclopedia. Like behind me on the wall back here on the bookshelf, I have an 8 DVD set, The Encyclopedia of Card Magic, from a well-known magician who's passed on now, Daryl. This to me is the encyclopedia of macro photography. If you want to learn something, it's in this book pretty much.
Well, no, there's things that I didn't put in the book. I didn't cover water droplet collision photography. I didn't cover tilt shift macro photography. I didn't cover macro videography. You know, there are things that a second edition might be able to include, or at least a second volume to this particular book.
A sequel.
But it's already 384 pages with nearly 90,000 words, so it better be good enough for most people right now.
It's a heck of a book, my friend. It is a heck of a book.
Well, thank you. And people can grab a copy of that at skycrystals.ca if you have not already. And you can find a link to that on my website at doncom.ca. There's a banner at photogeekweekly.com as well for you to find out where that book is. And if you've already ordered it, thank you so much. I am shipping out typically over 100 books a day. And I still have a big backlog, so forgive me if I haven't gotten to your book yet. But they're all getting out the door as quickly as I can make them happen.
Gary in the chat said the limited edition got to Texas last Saturday, far surpassed expectations. Beautiful. Yeah, I can imagine. I have the normal one. I can imagine the leather bound on this is gorgeous.
Yeah, the leather bound, you know, I did such a good job, as people have been telling me. I don't want to toot my own horn, on the cover of the regular edition with the spot gloss and everything else. It seems like no matter what I do with a leather bound edition, I can't match that level of beauty. It is more tactile. It's got an extra chapter in the back on the limited edition. And I painstakingly outlined one of my most detailed snowflakes ever to go on the cover of the limited edition. So thank you, Gary, for picking up a copy of that. I appreciate the support and glad they're getting into people's hands. Let's talk about our final story here. And this is Rare lenses. So it kind of comes in two parts that I found articles on in this past week. So I figured let's just bring it up and see what kind of unusual optics we may have come across over time. First part is rare Zeiss planar 50 millimeter f0.7 lens designed for NASA. Could fetch up to $150,000 at auction. And that follows on with another article that the world's longest autofocus SLR lens, the Canon EF 1200 millimeter f5.6, comes up for sale at auction in Germany. And the last one of those sold for, I think it was $180,000 or something. So both of these lenses are unique, unusual. And it's also an interesting discussion because I think it was the Metacon Speedmaster 50 or 55 millimeter f0.95 lens has just been released on the Leica L mount recently. And so fast glass is becoming more commonplace. A lens designed in 1966 should not be a hard thing to replicate now by modern lens manufacturers if they wanted to create something. But f0.7 was kind of interesting to see. There were only 10 copies of that lens ever made, 6 of which went to NASA. One of these lenses is currently up for auction by Lights Photographica auction. And by the way, if you haven't checked out the Lights Photographica auctions, there's all sorts of cool stuff you'll never be able to afford that are listed there. At least I can't. Too rich for my blood. So this Carl Zeiss.
You know what you should add to this, though?
What's
is that? This was actually designed for NASA.
Yes, it was.
This lens was made for NASA Apollo missions, specifically to photograph the dark side of the moon. Of the 10 copies, like you said, 6 of them went to NASA. 3 of them, we talked about this when we talked about low light lenses before. 3 of them went to Stanley Kubrick because he used them in the movie Barry Lyndon for a scene that was lit entirely by candles. It won an Oscar for cinematography in 1966 because of one of these lenses. But what amazes me is just look at that thing. Look at the knobs on this thing. It's amazing.
You know what? I love the tactile old knobs and dials on lenses from that era. I almost wish that I could get a modern lens that does have perfect fine autofocus, but if I want to flip that switch off, like I'm then riding in a 1970s muscle car kind of thing. Like it just has that feel to it. And it's been adapted, I think, to the Nikon F mount in this particular case. It's got a tripod mount option thing on it. But these lenses, these oddities, I'm actually, if it could be made then, and it doesn't look very big, I'm wondering, why Liowa or Venus Optics that has a Liowa brand, is it Zhongyi or Yongzi Optics? I can never get that name right. Or Seven Artisans or Per Gear or any of the other
esoteric brands.
The esoteric brands that are doing a lot of manual focus lenses that fit into all sorts of interesting niches. Why haven't they replicated this type of stuff? Because I would think that would be kind of fun.
Okay, so I'm gonna go. Mike Martin is in the chat, and I'm going to kind of go down a road he'll understand because he's in the music industry. You can recreate a Martin Herringbone guitar today. We have the technology, but a musician's going to want the whatever 1955 Martin Herringbone because it's going to sound differently no matter what you do. And while I recognize that they could probably recreate this, arguably the limitations that they had in that day gives this glass characteristics that I'm not sure they can recreate. In other words, it's almost like digital audio just never really captures what's on the original tape or vinyl in many cases.
True. Because there's a bit of, I guess, character to it, for lack of a better term. Yeah. But Stanley Kubrick in his film Barry Lyndon, the film wasn't even good enough at the time. They really pushed the limits, and we always talk about when it comes up to 0.7 aperture that they used it in that film. But it wasn't just all of a sudden we can shoot in candlelight now. No, they had like hundreds of candles in the room, and the candles themselves were not regular candles. They had like 3 or 4 wicks all wound together in order to be super, super bright in every one of these custom-made candles for that specific scene. That man pushed every limit of technology in order to make that scene work in that day, and he deserves accolades. Even though, you know what, I've seen the movie. It's not fantastic, but technically, it was one of the groundbreaking films of the era.
Well, and I'll go to the new movie now, Army of the Dead, which if you watch it, it was there are scenes with this, I don't want to spoil the movie, but just extreme shallow depth of field. It was shot with a 50 millimeter 0.9, and it's gorgeously done. The movie itself is kind of lazy, in my opinion, in the way that it attacks some things, but it's the same thing. When you take the technology and you utilize it in a way that accentuates it, its positives, I think you get some cool stuff. And I think we could do some amazing stuff with this lens, but it's completely different than this 1200.
Well, yeah, the Canon 1200 millimeter lens reminds me of a lens that I have here in my collection that requires two hands to hold. It's this guy right here. So this is massive. This is, I think, an airplane lens. It doesn't actually have a name on it, but it does say 100 millimeter f/0.73 on the front of that guy there. And I bought this after a story that we had covered many episodes ago, where somebody had took one of these and fit it inside like some Fresnel lens to see behind objects. And I remember that article, and then I tracked down a copy of the lens. I forget who makes it again. It's not on it at all anywhere. But I got one, and it is so gigantic and heavy. Yeah, I don't want the esoteric lens manufacturers to remake something like this, make something smaller. But that reminds me of that Canon 1200 millimeter f/5.6 lens. And man, they only made a few of these things. You would have to wait a few years if you ordered one, because some of the lens elements, they're so huge and so specialized. It's not just regular glass. If it's a fluorite lens element, Canon has to grow fluorite in a laboratory, and it takes time to
which
do
they
that.
did actually for this lens. And you can't really tell from the picture. Let me scroll it down where you can see this picture. You can't really tell a ton. Where's a better picture? There we go. You can't tell from this picture. This thing is 36 pounds. It's 2 feet 7 inches long, and that front barrel is 9 inches across. It was $90,000 when it was new, and they only made 2 a year, a total of about 12 or so. But you don't have to worry. Like if you wanted to use an ND filter, it's only 48 millimeters because it goes on the back.
Right.
So
yeah. It would have.
benefit.
Was it a filter drop in that case, or
I
was
think
it?
it was for a sheet, not a screw on. Yeah. B&H had one of these back in 2015, listed at $180,000.
Yep. And based on its rarity, and I love when camera manufacturers say, "I don't care how much it's going to cost. I don't care how long it's going to take us to make it. Let's just have a trophy lens."
Right.
And it's not even for consumers to buy, right? Like Sports Illustrated was, I think they bought a couple of these, and I'm sure government agencies may have invested in one in various parts of the world, but very few of them, I think, ever ended up into private hands, and now they're starting to get there. Mike says in the chat, by the way, that the limits of tech at the time would certainly have led to characteristics that make vintage glass special. That being said, bring on the remake.
Yeah, please bring on the remake.
The characteristics of those older lenses might be the types of coatings that they used, but that technology still exists today.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that should be, and if it has to be different coatings, well, so be it. That technology has just improved, and you might get less chromatic aberration and albeit less character, but still bring on the remake. And Andrew H says, referring to Stanley Kubrick, that he also pushed the film stock. Yeah. And so,
very true. Yeah.
So he did everything to make that work with that f/0.7 lens, but I can only imagine. I've shot with the Canon 85 millimeter f1.2 lens, and autofocus was a non-starter with that. In fact, I would often, I remember I rented a copy of it for my stepsister's wedding, and I was trying to focus on the eyes for people. And after a while, I just realized I'm just going to hold my hand on the focusing ring, hold my finger on the shutter button and just kind of take a whole bunch of photos while I slightly moved the focus in order to just say, okay, I know I just got 20 shots out of focus, but the 21st shot somewhere in the mix, that's going to have the eyes properly sharp.
Yeah, just rack the focus through a range. But I know wedding photographers who love that 85 1.2. They live on it as a portrait lens. I don't know how they shoot it. I see them shooting it at 1.2. They do it.
Yeah, and I tried, and that was the only technique that I had that actually worked. I'm sure that if I had more time with it, I would become a little bit more intuitive to exactly its ins and outs and how I can not just, and this is a technique that I use for macro photography of like shifting my entire body forward and backward, but your focus would become so shallow that, especially on a modern camera that has focus peaking, you wouldn't touch the focus. You get it in the same vicinity, and you just kind of lean forward or backward to shift your focus to make sure that it hits the eyes, because that is actually a more fine-tuned adjustment of physically moving or changing the distance between the subject rather than adjusting the focusing ring
And anybody
itself.
who's tried to rotate a dial at a micro level knows exactly what you're talking about. It just
especially if it's a high stressful thing, like if you are a wedding photographer and this is your gig. I mean, you're not totally relaxed like I was. I'm like, if these shots don't turn out well, it's all right. I'm not the official photographer for this thing.
Right.
It was just my experiment. But anyhow, I think that winds down our stories for the week, Steve. And before we get into our picks of the week, where can people find you online? We teased it earlier, behindtheshot.tv, correct?
Yes, behindtheshot.tv, or quite often I'm just hiding out in the backyard here, but so you can find me there too. Behindtheshot.tv is the podcast. You can also find Behind the Shot, the podcast, on YouTube. It's youtube.com/behindtheshot. We've got a we've got a Flickr group for Behind the Shot for the image critique shows that we do. And wherever you get your podcasts, you can find Behind the Shot there as well. My website is stevebrazel.com. It's like the country of Brazil, but it's 2 L's. And of course, I'm on Twitter and Instagram most of the time. It's at Steve Brazel or at Behind the Shot TV.
Yeah, on Twitter, and I follow you on Twitter. You're always commenting with a lot of our circle of friends and professional photographers, and having some great conversations about that. So make sure
you
follow Steve.
I will say there are some people out there, and I include you in this group. There are some people out there right now that are doing some amazing stuff on a creativity level. There are some great creatives out there. Photo Joseph is doing great work. Alex Lindsay is doing great work. You're doing an amazing work. Curtis Judd, Renee Ritchie, Ant Pruitt, the photo workshop I'm going to be doing with Freddie Clark and Ant Pruitt and Andrew Scrivani.
I actually have a recording for Hands-On Photography coming up soon with Ant, and very much looking forward to that discussion. I'm not sure if I should tease exactly what the topic is going to be yet.
Let it be a surprise, because he's had some amazing. He had Freddie Clark on there talking about food stuff. I was on there for a little bit. He had my buddy Shot Live Photo is what it is on Twitter, but Alan Hess was on there. You're going to be on there. He's doing killer stuff with Hands-On Photography. It really is.
He is. And so thank you, Steve, for telling people where people can find you online. I am at photogeekweekly.com. Check out the show notes, everything that we're talking about here. And I will put a link to the unboxing videos. There's the one that you did, Steve, but there was also one from fellow macro photographer Stuart Wood. And I'll make sure that anybody that wants to see that in anticipation of receiving their book gets a chance to do that. But we have our picks of the week section.
Oh, yes, we do.
And I want you to go first here. And I'm really curious as to your thoughts on your pick.
So I have been a user of this software since it first came out and was originally owned by Nick. And then Nick sold it to Google. They came out with Snapseed, kind of based on the Nick collection software. And then Google let it die. And there was a point in time where DxO bought the Nick collection, and their first release people complained about. And they complained because they said, oh, there's not a lot of new features. And now I got to spend $60 or whatever it was again. And
it used to be free under Google's banner.
And it was free under Google. Well, but Google let it die.
Yeah.
Because they weren't making money. I mean, if they were making a ton of money on it, maybe they wouldn't let it die. But DxO took it, and the first thing they did was there were tons of inconsistencies and problems and crashes under Photoshop. They fixed that. So that first release was getting everything stable and solid again and updating all of the code. Yes, the feature set was pretty close to identical to what it was before, but it worked. It was updated and it was solid. Well, now they have released version 4 of the Nick collection. This is my favorite, hands down, set of plugins that I ever use. This is Vivisa, and it's Silver Effects Pro and Color Effects Pro and a bunch of other plugins that are included in the Nick collection. And what they've done is the interface is completely different. I mean, I shouldn't say completely. There are a lot of new stuff. So there's more sliders on the side rather than having to do them through U points. The U points are streamlined, but the control points, the U points, can be saved in your presets now. That's really cool.
Oh, cool.
You can adjust the saturation of a specific tonal range. And they have something new called meta presets. And what this does is it lets you take, I'm going to try and describe this and fail. It lets you take multiple Nick plugins, do different settings, and save all of that from multiple plugins into one preset. Just in Lightroom now, there's a last edit feature where whatever you did last in Nick, you can reapply. There's a smart copy and paste. Silver Effects Pro, they took a feature that they've had in their image editor, DxO Photo Lab, called Clearview, which is, it's kind of like dehaze that's in Lightroom, but it's also a contrast tool and a bunch of other things. They've moved that into Silver Effects Pro. They've got better film emulations. Bottom line is, this software, as far as I'm concerned, is really, really well done. It's a great new update. It's not super expensive, and they have a 30-day free trial. If you decide to buy right now, it's on a launch sale for version 4 through the end of June. Instead of $149, it's $99. If you have a previous version, instead of a $79 upgrade, it's $59.99. So we'll call it $60. And to me, it is the $60 I paid to upgrade this may be the best photo investment I made in the last year.
That's an impressive statement, and I trust your opinion. So that's really cool. I'm gonna have to check it out. I haven't used Nick in a while. I did remember, finding value in the Silver Effects plugins. In fact, what I used to do is I would take a version of my image, run it through Silver Effects. Not because I wanted a black and white image, but because I loved the tonal treatment of an image. And then I would take that into Photoshop as a layer and change the blending mode on that layer to luminosity.
Yep.
And it would apply the tonal range to the color image. And then I would, using a layer mask, just kind of fade that off to only the parts of the image where that was useful to be represented.
What you just described to me, I'm gonna give somebody a reason why what you just said is so important. So I learned that tip from Alan Hess, who's a well-known music photographer. I mentioned him earlier. Shot Live Photo on Twitter. I learned that tip from Alan Hess, where we had both shot the tour with Roger Waters' The Wall. And he posted a picture and I went, oh my God, how did you get his leather jacket to look so like I can reach out and touch the leather? He said, I go to Silver Effects, I duplicate the layer, I go to Silver Effects Pro, I choose the 6th one, which is high structure smooth. I put that in luminosity mode on top of the color image. I lower the opacity to about 30%. And then if I don't want it in any areas, I mask it out. Boom, done.
There you go. It's exactly what I just described.
It is my favorite, hands down, it is my favorite processing tip, because it's not just a contrast that you're getting. It's this level of three-dimensional detail it will pop into almost any image. It's awesome.
Well, Steve, that is a great segue to my pick of the week, talking about three-dimensional detail, because my pick is something really simple. You were holding them up a number of times, just anaglyph glasses. Get some of these, people. You can, again, these are little lorgnettes. They actually don't have things that can sit on your eyes. You can just hold them up. But you can buy a pair of anaglyph glasses for easily under $10 on any marketplace website, whether it be Amazon or eBay or what have you. And why do you really care? Well, it's actually far easier for you to create 3D imagery than you've ever really thought about, because you haven't tried it, most people. So one easy way is to just physically put on a larger scale, it's called the cha-cha maneuver, where you just kind of shift your weight from one foot to the other, and you take one picture in one position, one picture in another position, and you can easily combine those together with free software called Stereo Photo Maker. And you can build anaglyphs within there, whether it's red and blue, or I think there's like orange and green glasses. There's modes where you can choose what anaglyph system that you want to be using, and you can start to experiment with stereoscopic 3D photography. I, for macro work in the past, have taken my camera on a focusing rail, but positioned it horizontally so that I'm not going through the subject in a linear fashion. I'm moving the camera left and right in a very calculated type of way. And I'll often actually take, 4 or 5 different images and combine whichever ones have the right separation that makes the most sense for me. And if you don't know what that is, like I didn't when I started trying, you start to experiment and see what works and what doesn't. Sometimes the effect can be too dramatic or too subtle. And so we are 3-dimensional creatures. I mean, we see in 3D, yet almost all of our photographic exploits are with a single lens in 2 dimensions. And it does a disservice to our senses to not see things in 3D. I'm not saying do it all the time. No, but I'm saying that we should really experiment with this stereoscopic 3D stuff. And honestly, a single-digit expense is all you need in order to start to play around with this type of stuff. And I've had a lot of people that have gotten my book, and they've seen the chapter on that, and they've started to experiment with it. And I've had some people send me anaglyphs of their own. So here's what I want you to do. If you do decide to go down this rabbit hole and buy a pair of these glasses and try to do something in 3D, send me a copy of the photo. I'd love to see it. I'd help you critique it, because there's different knowledge in putting together a stereoscopic 3D image rather than a regular photograph in terms of composition or setting the stereo window. I'll help you through it. Just show me what you got. Pick up a pair of anaglyph glasses and have fun. And stay creative along the way, exploring something brand new, using all the existing gear that you already have.
Well, and again, your book, I think it's page 355, is the start of the stereoscopic section of the book, is a great example of what can be done. And the book comes with these things. I'm not doing a commercial for your book. I'm just saying, if you want to see really good examples of what can be done and how cool it can be, here's a good starting point for you to look at.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. And thank you for being the guest host on this episode of Photo Geek Weekly. 150 episodes is a milestone, and hope for 150 more and more than that still going forward. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you to everybody that was in the chat. Terry says, time for a beer. Enjoy that beer. I might join you, Terry, virtually. But I'm still not fully vaccinated, Steve. Have you gotten both of your vaccines yet?
I've gotten both my vaccines. Yeah. The second one
life's
left
getting back
me
to normal
not
for
feeling
you.
good for a couple of days, but now I'm fully vaccinated and happy as heck.
Well, you might be able to get out and shoot, but for me, I still have to stay in. So I'm going to keep that tagline until I'm 2 or 3 weeks after my second vaccine. So for everybody listening, it's time to stay in and shoot.